The silence at Martha's saloon shattered like glass when Sophia Fields walked in for the first time in the summer of 1876, her eyes downcast and her hands trembling as she clutched a small piece of paper, her only hope for employment in the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory. The moment she approached the bar counter, the laughter began cruel and sharp when the patrons realized she wouldn't speak, not even to ask for work. "Cat got your tongue, missy," a bearded miner called out, slapping his knee in amusement. "Martha don't hire mutes in her establishment." Sophia's cheeks burned with shame as she slid the folded note across the counter. Martha Hillman, the robust owner of the saloon, unfolded it with calloused fingers, her eyes narrowing as she read the neat handwriting explaining Sophia's situation and request for work as a cleaner or kitchen help. "You ain't never gonna speak, not a word?" Martha asked loudly, causing more snickers to ripple through the room. Sophia shook her head, her auburn hair falling across her face like a protective curtain. "Well, I got no use for someone who can't holler when there's trouble," Martha declared, pushing the note back across the counter. The patrons roared with laughter, someone mimicking a mute person by opening and closing their mouth like a fish out of water. Sophia stood frozen, humiliation washing over her in waves, unsure where to turn next in this unfamiliar town. That was when she noticed him, a tall figure in the corner, watching the scene unfold with a frown etched on his sun-weathered face. Isaac Young didn't join in the laughter. His blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, observed her with interest rather than ridicule. As the town's most respected rancher, his silence carried weight, and those nearest to him gradually quieted their mockery. Isaac stood, his spurs jingling softly as he crossed the room. The saloon fell into a curious hush. Without a word, he pulled out a chair at his table and gestured for Sophia to join him. The invitation hung in the air between them, clear as day despite not a single word being spoken. Sophia hesitated, her eyes wide with uncertainty. In her 20 years of life, kindness from strangers had been rare, especially since she'd lost her voice to scarlet fever 3 years prior. With nowhere else to go and night falling fast outside, she slowly made her way to his table and perched nervously on the offered chair. For an hour, they sat in companionable silence while the saloon's regular business resumed around them. Isaac didn't pressure her to communicate, didn't stare expectantly, didn't treat her like some curiosity in a traveling show. He simply nursed his whiskey, occasionally nodding at passing acquaintances while providing her a safe harbor in the storm of mockery. When Martha brought him a plate of stew, he ordered a second without speaking to Sophia about it, simply placing it before her when it arrived. Her stomach growled loudly enough for him to hear, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. After she'd eaten, he slid a small notebook and pencil across the table. Sophia stared at the offering, then slowly picked up the pencil. "I'm Isaac Young," he said, his voice deep and gentle like distant thunder in summer. "I own the Double Circle Ranch north of town," she wrote carefully. "Sophia Fields, thank you for your kindness. Folks around here can be hard on newcomers," he said, "especially those who seem different. They'll come around eventually." She hesitated, then wrote, "I need work, anywhere that will have me." Isaac considered this, stroking his clean-shaven jaw. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, mentioned needing help with the cooking and cleaning. Ranch is growing and she can't keep up anymore. Would that interest you?" Sophia's green eyes lit up, the first genuine emotion he'd seen cross her face. She wrote quickly, "Yes, I'm a hard worker. When can I start?" "Tomorrow," he said, rising from his chair. "I'll arrange a room for you at the boarding house tonight." As they left the saloon together, Martha called out, "Taking in strays now, Isaac?" Isaac paused at the door, his hand at the small of Sophia's back. "Miss Fields is the new housekeeper's assistant at Double Circle, Martha. I expect she'll be treated with respect when she comes to town." The firmness in his voice silenced further commentary, and for the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek, Sophia felt a small spark of hope. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, she touched Isaac's arm lightly to stop him. When he turned, she met his eyes directly and smiled a genuine, grateful smile that transformed her entire face. Something shifted in Isaac's expression as he looked at her, something that neither of them could name yet, but that would grow in the days to come. Dawn broke early over the Double Circle Ranch, painting the distant mountains in hues of pink and gold. Sophia stood on the porch of the main house, taking in the vastness of the property. Pastures stretched toward the horizon where cattle grazed, corrals housed horses being broken for riding, and bunkhouses sheltered the ranch hands who were already busy with morning chores. Mrs. Peterson, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and no-nonsense efficiency, had welcomed Sophia warmly the previous evening when Isaac brought her to the ranch. "Don't you worry about not speaking," she'd said, patting Sophia's hand. "My sister's boy hasn't spoken a word since the war, and he's the best farmhand in Illinois. It's what's in your heart that matters." That morning, as Sophia helped prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, she caught glimpses of Isaac through the kitchen window. He moved with authority among his men, gesturing toward different parts of the property, clearly giving instructions for the day's work. Occasionally, his eyes would drift toward the house, and once he caught her watching. He tipped his hat slightly, and Sophia ducked back to her tasks, her cheeks warm. "Mr. Young is a good man," Mrs. Peterson commented, noticing the exchange. "Lost his wife and baby son to cholera 5 years back, threw himself into building this ranch afterward. Folks around here respect him because he's fair and works harder than anyone." Sophia nodded, absorbing this information as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. She couldn't help but feel a kinship with Isaac, recognizing in him the same quiet determination she'd cultivated since losing her voice, the resolve to keep moving forward despite loss. Over the next week, Sophia settled into life at the Double Circle. She worked tirelessly, rising before dawn to help with breakfast, spending days scrubbing floors, washing linens, and preparing meals. By nightfall, she would collapse into her small but comfortable room in the back of the house, muscles aching but with a sense of satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. Isaac respected her space, never intruding on her duties or treating her differently than any other employee. But she often caught him watching her not with pity or curiosity, but with something more complex, an interest that made her pulse quicken whenever their eyes met. On Sunday afternoon, when the ranch hands had their day off and Mrs. Peterson visited her sister in town, Sophia found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing preserves from the summer berries. She didn't hear Isaac enter until he cleared his throat softly. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, looking somewhat out of place in his own kitchen, his hat in his hands. Sophia smiled and nodded toward the table. She continued her work as he settled into a chair, watching her nimble fingers slice berries and measure sugar. "My mother used to make preserves," he said after a comfortable silence. "The kitchen would smell like this for days afterward." Sophia reached for her notebook, which she now kept in her apron pocket, and wrote, "My grandmother taught me. She said good preserves need patience, just like people do." Isaac smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his serious face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. "Your grandmother sounds wise. I've never been good at patience. Yet you sat with me in silence at the saloon," she wrote. Why? The question had been lingering in her mind since that first night. Why would this respected rancher, who could have any woman in the territory, take an interest in a mute newcomer with nothing to her name? Isaac considered her question, turning his hat in his hands. "I recognized something in you," he finally said. "Dignity, strength. I've seen plenty of people broken by this harsh country, but you weren't broken, just silent." Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something unspoken passed between them. Sophia felt her heart fluttering against her ribs like a caged bird. She turned back to her preserves, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. After a while, Isaac stood. "I have some books in my study. My late wife enjoyed reading. Would you like to borrow some? Sophia nodded eagerly. Books had been her comfort during the lonely years after losing her voice, when friends and even some family members grew distant, uncomfortable with her silence. His study was a surprisingly cozy room with a leather chair, a desk covered in ranch accounts, and a small bookshelf packed with volumes. As he showed her the collection, their hands brushed while reaching for the same book. The touch, though fleeting, sent a jolt through Sophia that made her step back slightly. Isaac noticed her reaction. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She shook her head quickly and wrote in her notebook, "You didn't. It's just been a long time since anyone treated me like a normal person." His expression softened. "You are normal, Sophia. Your voice is in your hands, your eyes, your smile. Some people just don't know how to listen properly." She blinked rapidly, fighting sudden tears. No one had ever expressed it that way before. On impulse, she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly in gratitude. That evening marked a turning point. As summer progressed into early autumn, Sophia and Isaac developed a routine. Each evening after supper, they would sit on the porch, Isaac smoking his pipe, Sophia with her notebook or mending, and watch the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in spectacular colors. Sometimes they would converse through her written notes. Other times, they simply enjoyed the companionable silence. Isaac began teaching her to ride, delighting in her quick learning and obvious joy on horseback. Soon, they were taking Sunday afternoon rides across the property, Isaac pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of how he'd built the ranch from nearly nothing after his personal tragedy. One golden afternoon in late September, they rode to a high meadow overlooking the ranch. Wildflowers still bloomed in purple and yellow patches, and the air carried the sweet scent of grass warmed by the sun. They dismounted to let the horses graze, and Isaac spread a blanket beneath a lone cottonwood tree. As they sat together, Sophia pulled out her notebook. "Tell me about your wife, if you don't mind." Isaac was quiet for so long that Sophia feared she'd overstepped. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "Elizabeth was a schoolteacher. Smart, kind, loved to laugh. We were childhood sweethearts back in Missouri, married young and moved out here to build something of our own." He paused, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Our son, James, was just 6 months old when the cholera came through. Took them both within days of each other." Sophia reached out, placing her hand over his. He turned his palm up, interlacing their fingers. "For 2 years after, I hardly spoke to anyone unless necessary," he continued. "Just worked from sunrise to sunset, building this ranch, too exhausted to dream at night. Folks around here called me the silent rancher for a while." Sophia squeezed his hand in understanding. "Maybe that's why I understood you that night at Martha's," he said, meeting her eyes. "I recognized someone who carried their pain quietly." Sophia's heart ached for him. She wrote carefully, "My silence came after scarlet fever when I was 17. The doctors said the illness damaged my vocal cords, but sometimes I think my voice disappeared because I had nothing left worth saying." Isaac read her words, then looked at her intently. "And now, do you have things worth saying now?" She hesitated, then wrote with trembling hands. "Yes, but I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" he asked softly. "Of hoping again. Of believing I could have a normal life with someone who sees me, not just my silence." Isaac's eyes never left hers as he spoke. "I see you, Sophia Fields. I've seen you since that first night." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken feelings. Isaac leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Sophia closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a gentle kiss that held both question and answer. When they returned to the ranch that evening, something had changed between them, a boundary crossed, a new understanding reached. Mrs. Peterson gave them a knowing look, but said nothing as they moved around each other in the kitchen with new awareness, their fingers brushing when passing dishes, their eyes meeting with secret smiles. However, their newfound happiness was soon threatened. 2 weeks after their first kiss, Sophia was in town buying supplies when she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. "Well, if it ain't the mute girl who ran away from home, your pa's been looking everywhere for you, Sophia." She turned to see Vernon Mathers, a man from her hometown who had once courted her before the fever and who had been the first to mock her silence afterward. He stood on the boardwalk with two companions, his smile predatory. "Your pa offered a nice reward for information on your whereabouts," he continued, approaching her. "But maybe we can work out a different arrangement, you and me." Sophia backed away, clutching her purchases to her chest. Vernon had always made her uncomfortable, even before she lost her voice, with his entitled manner and wandering hands. "Still won't talk, huh?" He grabbed her arm roughly. "You don't need to speak for what I have in mind anyway." Before Sophia could react, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Take your hand off her." Isaac stood a few paces away, his stance deceptively relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. Vernon's companions shifted nervously, recognizing the dangerous edge in Isaac's voice. "This ain't your business, young," Vernon said, though his grip on Sophia's arm loosened. "This girl belongs to her father and there's a reward for her return." "Miss Fields works for me," Isaac replied evenly, closing the distance between them, "and she doesn't belong to anyone but herself." Vernon sneered. "She's damaged goods, can't even scream if you hurt her. What use is a woman who can't talk?" Isaac's movement was so swift that Vernon had no time to react. In one fluid motion, Isaac had the man pinned against the wall of the general store, his forearm pressed against Vernon's throat. "Say another word about her," Isaac said, his voice deadly quiet, "and you'll find out exactly how much damage I can do without saying a word myself." The terror in Vernon's eyes was clear. When Isaac released him, he stumbled away, his companions following quickly. "This ain't over," Vernon called back, though he kept his distance. "Her pa will pay good money to get her back under his roof where she belongs." Isaac turned to Sophia, his anger melting into concern. "Are you all right?" she nodded, though her hands still trembled. When they returned to the ranch, she explained through written notes about her father, a bitter, controlling man who had seen her illness as divine punishment for her willfulness, and who had made her life miserable after she lost her voice, treating her as little more than an unpaid servant. She had finally fled when he'd arranged to marry her off to a much older widower who wouldn't mind a defective wife. "He has no legal right to force you back," Isaac assured her. "You're of age, but men like Vernon and your father don't always abide by the law." His words proved prophetic. 3 days later, Vernon returned with Sophia's father, Harold Fields, and the county sheriff. They arrived at the double circle during supper, the sheriff looking uncomfortable with his role in the affair. "Mr. Young," the sheriff said when Isaac met them on the porch, "Mr. Fields here claims his daughter has been taken in by you against his wishes, says she's unwell in the head and needs family care." Sophia appeared in the doorway behind Isaac, her face pale but resolute. "There she is," Harold Fields said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Come along, Sophia. Your place is with your family." Isaac didn't move from his protective stance. "Sheriff, Miss Fields is 20 years old and employed at this ranch of her own free will. She's perfectly sound of mind, just unable to speak due to illness. She needs protection," Harold insisted. "Being mute, she's vulnerable to exploitation." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Isaac, the implication was clear, and Isaac's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, Sophia stepped forward, handing the sheriff a letter she'd prepared after Vernon's appearance in town. The sheriff read it slowly, his eyebrows rising. "Mr. Fields," he said finally, "your daughter states here that she left home voluntarily after you attempted to force her into marriage with a man 3 times her age. She also mentions physical punishment when she refused." Harold's face darkened. "She's lying. She's always been imaginative, and since losing her voice, she's become unstable." "I've seen no evidence of that," Isaac countered. "She's the most level-headed woman I've ever met." The standoff might have continued, but Mrs. Peterson emerged from the house, her expression fierce. "Sheriff Davis, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You know my judgment of character. I've worked with Miss Fields for months now, and she's as sane as you or I, just silent. And if you're wondering about her relationship with Mr. Young, I can assure you it's been nothing but proper." The sheriff looked relieved to have an excuse to side with Sophia. "Mr. Fields, I see no grounds to force a grown woman to return with you against her will." "The law's clear on this matter." Harold's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat, echoing Vernon's earlier threat. "No decent man will have you now, girl. You'll see what happens to women who disobey their fathers." As they rode away, Sophia's composure finally broke. She trembled violently, and Isaac led her gently to the porch swing, holding her while silent sobs shook her body. "He can't hurt you anymore," Isaac murmured against her hair. "I won't let him." That night, unable to sleep, Sophia sat at her small desk and wrote in her journal. The confrontation had shaken her deeply, but it had also crystallized something in her heart. For the first time in years, she had stood her ground, refusing to be controlled by fear or shame, and she hadn't stood alone. The next morning brought an unexpected development. A telegram arrived for Isaac from the sheriff. Harold Fields and Vernon Mathers had been arrested for attempted robbery of the Redemption Creek Bank in the early hours of the morning. Apparently, Harold had decided if he couldn't force Sophia home, he would get another way, money he desperately needed due to gambling debts. "They'll be sent to the territorial prison for years," Isaac told Sophia as they sat on the porch that evening. "You're truly free of them now." Relief washed over her like a cleansing rain. She wrote in her notebook, "I've been running and hiding for so long. It feels strange to know I don't have to anymore." Isaac took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "What will you do now? You could go anywhere, be anything." Sophia considered the question, looking out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary. Finally, she wrote, "I'd like to stay if you'll have me." "As my housekeeper?" Isaac asked, his voice carefully neutral. She met his eyes directly and shook her head. Then, gathering all her courage, she wrote, "As whatever you would like me to be." The air between them stilled. Isaac reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle. "I want you as my partner, my equal, my wife if you'll consider it, but only when you're ready." Sophia's heart soared. She leaned forward and kissed him, trying to pour all the words she couldn't say into that single action. When they parted, she wrote, "I'm ready now. I've never been more certain of anything." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Creek. The entire town attended, many curious to see the mute woman who had captured Isaac Young's heart. Martha from the saloon approached Sophia before the ceremony. "I was wrong about you that first night," she admitted gruffly. "Never seen Isaac smile so much as he has these past months." "Reckon that's worth more than all the words in the world." Sophia nodded her forgiveness, too happy to hold onto old hurts. Mrs. Peterson had helped her sew a simple white dress, and wildflowers from the high meadow formed her bouquet. When the minister asked if she took Isaac as her husband, Sophia nodded firmly, her eyes never leaving Isaac's. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she opened her mouth and whispered in a raspy, barely audible voice, "I do." Isaac's eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears. It was the first time Sophia had attempted to speak in 3 years, the words painful and rough but unmistakable. "I practiced," she whispered again, the effort evident on her face. "For you." Later, after the celebration and well wishes, after they were finally alone in the ranch house that was now truly their shared home, Sophia explained through written words that she had been secretly practicing speaking just those 2 important words for weeks, determined to voice her commitment aloud. "The doctor always said I might regain some speech with time," she wrote. "It may never be more than a whisper and never for long conversations, but I wanted you to hear me say yes to our future." Isaac kissed her hands, her wrists, her lips. "Your silence has always been full of meaning to me," he said. but I'll treasure those words for the rest of my life. As autumn turned to winter and winter yielded to spring, Sophia and Isaac built their life together at the double circle. Her voice remained limited, a few whispered words at a time, used sparingly and with effort, but between her notebook, her expressive eyes, and Isaac's attentive understanding, they communicated more clearly than many couples who filled their days with empty chatter. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Sophia started a vegetable garden that became famous throughout the county, and under her management, the main house became a warm center for the ranch community. Isaac expanded their herds and built a reputation for fair dealing that brought buyers from as far as Chicago. One year after their wedding, as they sat on their porch swing watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sophia took Isaac's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. His eyes widened in understanding, then filled with joyful tears. "Really?" he whispered. She nodded, smiling radiantly, and whispered back the words she had been practicing for this moment. "Our family grows." Isaac gathered her in his arms, his heart too full for words. They had both known loss, both endured silence and loneliness. But here, in this place they had built together, they had found a love that needed no grand declarations, a love expressed in patient understanding, in steadfast presence, in the courage to begin again. By the following spring, the double circle welcomed a daughter with Sophia's auburn hair and Isaac's blue eyes. They named her Hope, for what she represented to them, both the promise that even after the darkest silences, life could still offer new beginnings and unexpected joy. And on quiet evenings, long after the ranch hands had retired and the house had settled into slumber, Isaac would sometimes find Sophia singing wordlessly to their daughter, a gentle humming that carried all the love her voice couldn't express in conventional ways. In those moments, watching his wife and child bathed in lamplight, Isaac knew with absolute certainty that some of life's most profound communications required no words at all. Years passed, and the double circle became known not just for its fine cattle and fair business practices, but for the extraordinary partnership at its heart. Travelers passing through Redemption Creek would often hear the story of the silent woman and the patient rancher, how he had sat with her until she was ready to speak, how she had given him back his voice when grief had silenced him, and how together they had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. Their love story became something of a legend in Wyoming territory, not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it spoke to a fundamental truth: that sometimes the most important messages are conveyed not in what we say, but in how carefully we listen.